Welcome, everyone. Thanks for taking some time out of your evenings to attend this webinar on wildfire and wildfire preparedness in Pierce County. We're going to go ahead and get things kicked off so we can stay on schedule. My name is Nick Cusick, Climate Program Manager with the Pierce Conservation District, and I will be your host for the evening. We're going to be covering a lot of ground when it's coming to being prepared for this summer's wildfire season. So grab a pen and paper if you'd like, and let's get started. But first, I wanted to provide you with a quick introduction to Pierce Conservation District and to our speakers. Pierce Conservation District is a non-regulatory form of government, meaning we don't tell you what to do or punish you if you don't do it. We're all about volunteer service and helping people that need it. We provide residents of Pierce County with the resources, training, and technical know-how to prepare folks to make their best decisions on how to manage their land sustainably and, in the case of wildfire, safely. We do a lot of different things from agriculture, water quality, urban gardening, habitat restoration, and renewable energy. And over the past several months, we've added wildfire to that list. We've got an excellent lineup of speakers for you today. I'll give a quick rundown of these folks, but they'll also have the chance to introduce themselves later on in the program. Paul Sowers will be first up. Paul is the volunteer fire chief for Greenwater and Crystal Mountain fire districts, and he'll be covering the history of wildfire in the county, as well as how wildfire shows up today. Nate Barrons will be next. Nate has been in this game for almost 20 years and now is the fire manager at the Washington DNR Pinnacle Unit, which covers Pierce and King counties. Nate's going to be showing you some of the basics on how to protect your property from wildfire. Rounding out the program, we have a Q&A panel, which includes Jake Weigley, Lieutenant with Orting Valley Fire and Rescue, and also their wildfire manager. We have Kelsi Mottet from Whidbey Island Conservation District. While Kelsi is not from Pierce County, she has lots of experience when it comes to the Firewise program. And last, but certainly not least, we have John Sharp, one of the resident leaders for the Trilogy Firewise community near Bonnie Lake. John will be sharing what it's like to start a Firewise community in your neighborhood. Special thanks to these five for devoting their Wednesday evening for this webinar. Finally, before we get started, I will be emailing out this follow-up form if you would like to be added to our wait list to receive resources and help to prepare your property for wildfire. The link to the form is right here if you would like to write it down, but you'll get it in an email too. I'll just give folks a second or two to be able to write it down. Spelling it out, it is bit.ly/PCD wildfire. You'll be asked whether you're interested in follow-up presentations for your HOA board, chipper services for your neighborhood, or wildfire hazard property assessments, among a number of other different things. I do want to stress that resources are contingent upon our securing future grant funding, so we might not be able to respond to your requests immediately. However, you will be added to our wait list, and we will follow up with you once funding allows us to do so. All right, well, I think that covers things from my end. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn over the screen to Chief Paul.
So fire seasons recently touch a little bit. I mean, globally, we all know what's happened in places like Australia. California is really reaching the point where their fire season almost goes year round. Certainly the rest of the nation, I looked right now on what's the INSA web page, which is a great resource to track fires in the country. And they have something like 7 fires over 10,000 acres already going on down in Arizona and New Mexico. And they have 2 that are actually well over 100,000 acres. Historically, if you want to look at the history of wildland fire on the national scale from years 1983 to 1999, the average acres burned per year was 2,976,874, give or take. In the last 6 years, between 2015 and 2071, the total acres were 56,341,065 for an average of 8,048,723, which is a factor of about almost 3 times more than a much longer period before the turn of the century. So clearly we are seeing more extreme fire seasons. Western Washington, there's traditionally been kind of an expression in the fire service that Western Washington doesn't burn. I would submit that that is not a complete statement. It doesn't burn very often, but when it does burn, we get some incredible fires because, again, the fuel load on this side of the mountains is really more extreme than almost the rest of the American West. And when it does reach that level of extreme dryness, the fire behavior you get is just terrifying. One thing we do have here that is a real benefit to us is we can still count on the season to kill the fire season. So, you know, when we get into the second half of September, and we keep our fingers crossed, and we usually start to get that cooler, damper weather that really puts the brakes on the fire season. And we'll talk about that when we talk about a couple of our fires we've had in the last few years, because it's a huge benefit to our firefighting operations. One thing that does affect us locally, and why I bring up the extreme fire seasons that we've been experiencing nationally, is there's a domino effect in resource management throughout the country. And in the fires that we have had around here, you reach a point in the fire season where you're really competing nationally for the resources, and those resources are triaged depending on the greatest risk to values, to people and property. And so one of the things that fire managers are really coming up against on a regular basis in recent years is just flat the unavailability of resources when you get into the height of the fire season. So we'll talk about the North Peak fire first. That happened in 2017, started in mid-August on the east side of the Cascade. So it actually started out as an Eastern Washington fire in the Union Creek drainage, which is in a wilderness area. It was lightning strike. Lightning strikes in wilderness area have a special degree of difficulty because the difficulty of accessing the fire is pretty high, and this was a good example of that. For a long time, it stayed on the east side of the mountains. It moved north primarily due to the prevailing weather flows, and really, I was watching it from Crystal Mountain almost every day, and you know, you could almost see the fire behavior start to diminish as the days went on. And then it crossed the Pacific Crest on September 5th. And the reason it crossed the Pacific Crest is we had one of our red flag warnings, and we had a pretty strong east wind come in. The fire management team was on the east side, based out of the now Cliffdale area. Pretty good sized team, had a lot of work to do over there. I was in touch with them and attending the meetings and so forth. And they basically let me know that with the east wind event, they expected the fire to cross the crest sometime in the afternoon of the 5th. But they didn't really think that it was going to be much of a factor at that particular time. That didn't turn out to be the case. Crystal Mountain, we had a smoke layer that was about halfway down the ridge. You really couldn't see much of anything. Crystal Mountain made the very wise decision not to operate that day, so that really saved us a lot of trouble when it came to evacuations. So about 7 o'clock or so, was headed over to get a bite to eat and spend the night up there, and turned around and saw a wall of flame about a half-mile long with probably 100-foot flame lengths pop out from below the smoke level, already halfway down the ridge towards the resort. So at that point, we decided it would be a good time to evacuate. So we did. And actually that went fairly smoothly because everybody up there was already well prepared. And we got everybody out just fine. And then we had our resources in place for our structural protection plan. We had a lot of areas sprinklered, and we had engines staged to do structural protection. And we're looking at this wall of fire coming down at us, and basically doing the math on how much fire we could actually fight. And one thing about wildland fire, a lot of our preparation work and the Firewise work is based on keeping fire from getting into the canopy and keeping that extreme fire behavior from occurring. Once it starts doing that, basically your best option is just get out of the way. So we withdrew to the bottom of the boulevard that night. what happened at that point was the fire had been pushed over the ridge, which runs north-south, very aggressively. I've never seen fire go downhill that fast. It grew from 19,000 acres to 44,000 acres in 24 hours. But kind of the saving grace was once it dropped down the west side of that ridge, it was sheltered from the wind. And so the behavior died down a little bit, and it didn't progress all the way down to the ski resort. It did move very quickly north along the ridge tops and became a threat to the Forest Service cabins at the bottom of Crystal Mountain Boulevard. So we went ahead and evacuated those. And then at 3 o'clock in the morning, we drove back up to Crystal to see if it still was even there, and it was fine. So we set back up and implemented our structural protection plan. And at that time, the east wind had died down and the fire behavior had settled down quite a bit. Final tally on that particular fire was 55,000 acres. And we got a couple great management teams in there, and they built a great box around the fire and just kind of waited it out. By that time, we were in mid-September. The weather was starting to turn. And as I said before, that fire was nicely killed by the weather for us. After that, we had the Wrong Creek fire, and that was the following year. Different fire, different factors in play. What was interesting about it is our community was still a little gun shy due to the North Peak fire. So this fire, the Wrong Creek fire, was up the West Fork of the White River. Again, it was started by lightning in mid-July, and it was started across on the other side of the river where the bridge had been taken out by a flood years ago. So once again, it started in an inaccessible area, but it was in a north-south valley, and it was fairly sheltered. So we did not have an east wind effect on that fire. And it actually did later on go through 2 red flag warnings without ever really making any big runs or really showing any extreme fire behavior. And its final tally was around 300 acres. And one of the things about that one that was interesting, and one thing that's very important to think about when you're talking about wildland fire, is when you're planning to fight a wildland fire, when it's the DNR or your local fire department or Forest Service, we're not going to get firefighters killed to go chase a fire into hostile terrain. One of the most important things is you need to be able to support the operation. You need to be able to support the firefighters you've put in place. And this again is in the Wrong Creek fire. One of the reasons we didn't get a lot of resources, it was up a valley. It was a long ways from any values to be protected. And the current and anticipated fire behavior wasn't going to threaten anything. So the management team that came in to run that fire was very cautious about putting firefighters in harm's way without the ability to support them. You know, there was a lack of helicopters, so if someone had gotten hurt, the ability to evac them out to medical care was very limited. So those are the kind of decisions and the kind of, I guess, the triage you have to do in any given situation for how you're going to fight a fire. And once again, that fire was put in what's called a monitor status. They had lookouts staffing it throughout the month of August. And once again, the fall weather came in and knocked it down for us. Our most recent large fire was in 2020, and this one was a little bit interesting. It wound up being named the Fish Fire. Started on September 8th, 2020. During an east wind event, we had approximately 50-mile-an-hour winds out of the east, and it was a hot, dry wind. And it took down a power line adjacent to 410, about milepost 32, which is roughly halfway between Greenwater and Enumclaw. And that power line arced and started to fire on an extremely steep hillside directly overhanging the road. Had rock faces and lots of trees just kind of hanging on the hillside. We rolled up on that thing, and if you can see the picture, I guess it would be on your right on the screen. That's basically what it looked like. It was about as fast moving fire as I've ever been on, and I was really glad we came in it from the windward side. It gave us time to sort of make a plan here. So our plan was, because we couldn't access 410 to get to the other side of it, we called in resources from Enumclaw and requested DNR immediately, and they came in and did a great job managing that. But because of the damage to infrastructure, it took out the power lines, the phone lines, and it closed the highway for 2 months. It was a little bit of a challenge for our community just to manage the logistics of everyday life in that circumstance. It really never threatened any buildings. It was never a direct threat to the community. But fortunately, we were able to build a bypass road around it using some existing roads, and kind of had to take convoys of locals up and down the road to do their shopping and get to work, really into November. It was very damaging, and it happened at about the same time that the Sumner Grade fire did. And that was a great example of how we're starting to see more aggressive fire behavior in the urban interface of wildland, where you're getting these pockets of wooded areas that are in residential areas, and they're starting, we're starting to get a lot of pretty good sized fires there that are moving pretty fast. One of the big risks with the fish fire, and one of the reasons they had to close the road for so long, was if you look at the picture, you can see how the ground itself is basically on fire. Most of Western Washington, in the forest, the ground is basically flammable. It's mostly organic material. And in this case, the ground burned out a lot of the organic material that was helping support the trees, helping support those rock faces. So traveling up and down 410 there was something that was too high a risk to really accept. So that's kind of the short version of what we've been doing. Over the last few years, there's been a distinct and measurable increase in the severity of fire seasons. I think if I look at a chart I pulled up here, there have been 3 years in the last 7 years where there's been over 10 million acres burned in the country here. Lots of increase in the urban interface, which is where residential areas come up against forested areas. A lot more people moving out into areas like our area. The population out here is growing. A lot more homes, a lot nicer homes. We have lightning strike fires that may be, caused by the normal summer storms. We're getting an increase in human activity and careless behavior out here. Has certainly been during COVID. A lot of people, quite reasonably, decided that the best thing they could do was go spend some time in the woods, and they did. Sometimes those people weren't super careful. Every fire season is now a huge strain on resources nationally. I mean, the national firefighting machine is really a remarkable machine. The way it can deliver resources around the country, but it's not particularly quick. It's like a moving city, and it's being outstripped by the need in the last few years. So what's happened a lot in Pierce County, and the fire departments that I work with and involved with directly, is really municipal and rural fire districts. They're really changing their operational model, and they're evolving to kind of proactively address the need for wildland responses in the urban interface. I know Zane down in Orting has been really a good leader in pre-staging resources, making sure a strike team is available during the worst parts of fire season in order to try to get on those fires and keep small fires small. It's really good, kind of turning into the new model for the fire service. You can't just be a structural firefighter anymore. You need to be schooled in wildland firefighting because you're going to encounter it. And the other part of that is residents need to be active partners in the effort to minimize the occurrence and mitigate the effects from the wildland fires that we're seeing and the increased risk. There's a lot of people that have a lot of theories about why this is happening. The problem with that sometimes is what I've seen is as soon as you start talking about why it's happening, as soon as you start talking about forest practices or climate change, then everybody takes a side. And we need to move away from that and just accept the reality of what we're dealing with and kind of work proactively and together to start implementing some solutions. That's about it for what I have.
Thanks, Paul. You bring a lot of really great history, and perspective here to understand where we are at right now. I'm going to go ahead and shift quickly over to Nate now. Nate, if you want to go ahead and share your screen, I'm going to put you up front.
All right, give me a second here. How's my audio there, Nick?
It's solid.
Awesome. And let me know when you can see my screen.
Yep, you're good to go.
Okay, from the beginning. Okay, so good evening, everybody. I first want to start by thanking all of you for participating tonight. It's a real pleasure to have folks that are interested in this particular issue that we deal with. So again, my name's Nate Barrons. I am the Fire Unit Manager for the Washington Department of Natural Resources in the Pinnacle Unit, which is Pierce and King counties. And I'm here to talk to you, build a little bit on what Chief Sowers talked about. He gave a real good background on, the challenges of suppression, the reactive component of fire management, putting the fire out. And I think he did a really good job of kind of transitioning here into, the responsibilities that we all share as citizens, homeowners, property owners, and what we can do both within our own property and within the communities that we live in. So, my title slide here is Firewise Communities in the Home Ignition Zone. I really am going to focus on the home ignition zone and what we can do in and around individual properties kind of at the parcel level. But all of that then leads into, of course, the overall effort to be a Firewise community. And I'll kind of close with some details on that. Okay. There we go. A little bit of lag time here, so bear with me here with my slides. So this is just an example before we get started with some of the details of what we're looking to achieve when we talk about home hardening and defensible space in the home ignition zone. You can see here that a wildfire has burned completely around this particular property, and it remained unscathed, undamaged as the fire passed. And when we talk about community resilience, landscape resilience, that's ultimately what we're talking about here, is the ability with a truly fire adapted community to be resilient to wildfire. Ultimately, the goal being with minimal to no input from folks like myself and Chief Sowers in the event of a wildfire. It allows us to not have to place resources at individual homes. It frees us up to work at suppressing the fire across the landscape and not doing point protection. The more you can do as an individual homeowner, the more you can provide us as fire suppression and fire management professionals with a good foothold, with a good starting place when it comes to fire suppression. So, Chief made mention of this. This is just a quick diagram of the basics of fire. We don't have the fire triangle. We don't have fire if we remove one of these three, whether it be oxygen, heat, or fuel. We have to have all three present in order to sustain combustion. And then on the bottom here, we have what we call the fire behavior triangle, and it's very wildfire specific. Once we have that ignition on the landscape, we have to have fuel, the weather, and the topography. That is what drives the type of behavior that we see with fire. So, the Chief made mention of this. Fire burns faster uphill. You increase slope, you increase fuel densities, and then you add the weather component like that east wind event that he talked so effectively about. That's what creates the type of monster fire behavior that is very difficult to suppress. And in those events, that's where home hardening and management of the home ignition zone becomes so important, because that really does become the primary tool in extreme fire events for mitigating the effects of the fire on your personal property. So again, here's just another slide. I thought the Chief closed very excellently by highlighting how, sometimes this can get political. There's no need, in my opinion, to discuss the impact or of anthropogenic nature of climate change. The reality is, over the course of my 2-decade career, it has gotten hotter, it has gotten drier. And as the Chief so effectively said, the causes of that to us as wildland fire managers is almost irrelevant. We're dealing with an increasing fuel structure that's increasingly drier, hotter temperatures, longer duration heat spells during the summer, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that's just what this highlights. Increasing air temperatures, decreasing summer rains, earlier snow melts. This all leads to drier fuels in the forest. So just a quick slide, not from Washington here per se. This is just an indicative photo of a coniferous forest that is similar to what we have here in Western Washington, and then of course that urban interface, that urban infrastructure mixed in with it with a steep hillside. And this is the type of thing ultimately we're looking to avoid. So to get into a little bit more of the specifics here, this slide's just to give you a visual indicator of what we talk about when we're talking about fuels reductions. And vegetation is the primary fuel we talk about when it comes to wildland fire. And so, on the top, we're looking at a forest that is indicative of an unmanaged stand. We have what we call ladder fuels. We have vegetation that's spanning that gap between the forest floor and the tree canopy. And as the chief so accurately mentioned, once that fire is into the tree canopy, suppression operations become almost a moot point. All of our efforts, for the most part, are to keep that fire out of the tree canopy. And so through proper vegetation management, both on a micro and a macro scale, we can eliminate that ladder fuel. And that's what these slides are visually representing here. So now bringing that, around out of the forest and a little bit more into the urban area, we've talked about defensible space. And what we mean by that is having a structure that has vegetation cleared, fuels managed, is properly hardened and built of appropriate materials so that it can be defendable by a minimal number of resources during a wildfire event. The chief made mention of structural triage. In an event of a wildfire in any particular community, we have limited resources. And if we do have to do triage operations where, we have a limited amount of resources, what is defensible? Do we have a safe place to put firefighters? Can we put an engine in your driveway that can turn around and egress and keep those firefighters safe in the event that that's necessary, as an example? But where we begin this conversation is with these zones. There's the concept of having 3 zones around any particular habitation or home structure, and you'll see that listed here. Zone 1's the immediate zone, 0 to 5 feet. What is right up against the home? And this is where we talk about removing wood piles. Making sure that propane tanks aren't up, are a proper distance away from the house so that if they do levy, you're not damaging the structure. Zone 2, we take it from 50 to 30 feet, out past some of those patio structures, some of the other things that we have around our homes, making sure that ornamental vegetation has a proper canopy distance from surface fuels, so that we don't have, brush vegetation right down onto the lawn or onto areas that aren't irrigated, for example. And then finally, the extended zone, taking that out to 100 feet or more from the structure, and making sure that as the greater vegetation from the surrounding area, as again managed with having adequate canopy height, spacing, et cetera, et cetera. One thing I do want to note here is this is optimal. Obviously, not all properties may even, the property owner may not even have ownership of all of the distance of a particular zone here. This is just simply meant to give a visual representation of the immediate areas to treat, and then progressing out from this of a particular structure as we move back into the actual forested environment. So this is kind of a side profile view. I know there can be misconceptions about what fuels treatments in the home ignition zone can entail. And it doesn't necessarily mean that we need to clear all vegetation, that we're going to just, pave a big moat around our house. As you'll see here in zone 1, there can be trees even fairly close to the structure if they're managed properly. The bole of a tree, the trunk of a tree is fairly resilient, and dependent upon species can be really resilient to a ground fire. And if we make sure that we don't have those ladder fuels that I talked about earlier, that it's going to allow that fire to creep into the canopy, and if we've managed the canopy, as we've seen in this zone 1 image here, that eliminates the ability for that fire to creep into that canopy. And so therefore, it's possible to have vegetation. I've heard people even say, oh, well, if we do Firewise, we can't even have a tree that's within falling distance of our structure. And that's simply not true. And I think this is one of the slides that very accurately represents that. And again, we progress out into zone 2, into zone 3. And again, it's lifting that that tree canopy, the skirt of that tree, and separating it from ground fuels that are going to sustain a ground fire, which is the primary mode of transport of wildfire across the landscape. So again, here, this takes it a bit further. We're seeing overlapping zones here, and you're going to hear a lot about, if any of you decide to pursue Firewise, and I think John will probably speak to that as well a little bit later, is collaboration. If any one individual property owner in a greater community treats their property out to their zone 3, that's great. But if we haven't, quote unquote, connected all those dots, meaning the neighbors haven't done any treatment, what good does an island of treated ground do us within a sea of untreated fuel? And so collaboration, cooperation amongst neighbors, as I think this slide very well illustrates, is absolutely critical, because ultimately property boundaries are one thing, but those home ignition zones are often going to cross those types of boundaries. And so, making sure that collaboration is occurring when it comes to these types of fuels treatments. And I know the chief can speak to this as well. We do this at an agency level all the time when it comes to landscape level treatments on agency administered lands, et cetera. It requires a lot of collaboration because ultimately personal jurisdictions, agency jurisdictions, and things, overlap. Wildfire does not know a line on a map. It's going to move across the landscape as the topography, the weather, and the fuels align. So just something to keep in mind there. Another side profile view here. Again, I think pretty accurately demonstrating, the types of things were to occur here, what we would want to treat. And then I've got just some visual examples here of the types of things that we're looking to eliminate. You've got heavy brush here right next to some propane tanks. While they may not be right up against a structure, they're right up against wildland fuels that are highly susceptible to ignition and will sustain high amounts of heat and fire over a long period of time. So again, some of the things that we talk about when it comes to home hardening and that home ignition zone, making sure that we've got leaf litter and things cleaned out of our gutters. Once a wildfire moves into a community, oftentimes it is spread by ember wash in a high wind event that blows embers into unprotected soffits, into needle-filled gutters and drains. That then take that ember and give it a place to live, give it a place to grow because of that uncleaned, debris and detritus that will sustain ignition. So, it's just a basic kind of overview, but those are the types of things that we think about when we talk about home hardening. Construction materials are another component of that. Not having that shake shingle roof, making sure that it's a more modern product that's more fire resistant, all the way to, having a metal roof and things like that. So again, keeping our properties clean, and debris at least separated from wildland fuels, particularly here on the left. This was one that I thought was real indicative of, not only is there a large amount of just kind of urban debris, but the wildland fuels and vegetation have grown up amongst it, within it, and a progressing wildfire is going to consume that quite quickly, and potentially spread that to surrounding structures. So again, this is just kind of indicative of the types of things we're looking to avoid in that urban interface. Again, wood pile up against the front of the house, debris collecting along gable edges, all that kind of things. These are just the basic things that we as homeowners can do, not just for maintenance of our property from a general sense, but that will benefit us in a wildfire event as well. And then, kind of finally making sure, that we're accurately signed, that you've got a good address marker, whether it's at the foot of your driveway or, on your porch post or whatnot. It's really critical. We have a lot of digital and geospatial tools available to us in the fire service now that help us locate addresses and find where, fires have been reported, et cetera. But I can't emphasize this enough. Making sure that you've got an adequate, address marker on your property in the event of a wildfire or any kind of EMS response, quite frankly, that's going to benefit you, cut down response times, and increase the effectiveness of said response. And ultimately, this is just another indicator of what can occur. The entire Western United States, Washington included, is a naturally fire-prone environment. The fire return interval, here on the west side, as the chief mentioned, is greater than it is on the east side, but it's still here. And the landscapes that we have are naturally adapted to its presence. And so when we're living amongst it, we just need to make sure that we've got some of these Firewise concepts in mind. And, Firewise is a national program. It's run by the NFPA. DNR has a wide variety of assistance tools and things that we can assist you with. Our primary point of protection is unincorporated lands across the state. But we work very closely with municipal fire departments as well as the fire protection districts, and can assist with Firewise information, as well as any of the other things associated with wildfire mitigation. And again, this is what we're looking for. A wildfire passed this community. Sure, it blackens some of it around it, but overall the structures and even a lot of the ornamental vegetation is still intact. So there's my contact information. Like Nick said at the beginning, we're going to hold questions until the very end. I will be here for those, but feel free to contact me. If I don't have the answers for whatever questions you have, I'm sure I can point you in the direction of someone who does. So with that, that's the end of my report.
Excellent job, Nate. Thank you for sharing all of that information. Those photos especially really illustrated some of the points you were making. I'm going to switch this now over to what we're calling our Q&A panel. They're going to have a few minutes each to just introduce themselves, their history with Firewise. They have a lot of really great background with all of this. And then we're going to dive into some questions. So I'm only seeing a few questions so far, so start typing those in there. And we will just kick off with this. So Kelsi, why don't you go ahead and kick off with just sharing who you are and your work with Firewise communities.
Absolutely. Well, again, thanks everyone for staying here with us. As was mentioned, I'm from Whidbey Island and was invited to participate and share the perspective of my role as a conservation district planner and outreach coordinator. Hopefully that can help with both agency partners and you and your communities. I started our Whidbey Island Firewise program in close partnership with our regional Northwest DNR, Department of Natural Resources, Salish unit out of the Cedar-Woolley area, and our local Central Whidbey Fire and Rescue District. We started it as a pilot program in 2016. We wanted to test out this idea of developing this multi-agency conservation district, fire district, DNR, coming together and providing a suite of support in terms of community building and outreach expertise, structure fire expertise, and wildland firefighting expertise, along with forest health and resiliency. We tried to package that all together. And in our initial implementation year in 2016, had a really great opportunity to meet hundreds of folks in our rural Central Whidbey Fire District. As a result of that, we've created a model that we think works really well for our area. Our program's expanded to include all of our rural fire districts on Whidbey Island. We are a larger island than some of the ones you might think of up in the San Juans. So we're not too far from you and have a unique ecology here that what we do is take the Firewise national framework and we've tailored it. And we've tailored it in a way that honors the local fire ecology and the communities and cultures that we're serving. So I'm excited to be here today and happy to share any resources and knowledge in terms of our program, how it's been built, and how that can be something you can do in your communities down in Pierce County.
Thanks, Kelsi. John, let's popcorn over to you. Why don't you introduce yourself and what you're working on with your Firewise community?
My name is John Sharp, and I've lived in the Pierce County area for the last 40 plus years. But in the fall of 2017, my wife and I purchased a home in Trilogy of Tehaleh, which is a 55 plus community located within the Tehaleh planned community master plan. And we're just south of Bonnie Lake. Was not long after we moved here, listening to neighbors start to talk about the lack of access in and out of our area and all the trees around us and all the debris in the forest that the neighbors and I all started talking about what could be done to help make our homes more safe. And somebody mentioned the program Firewise, and I said, okay, let's see what we can figure out. So we called East Pierce Fire, talked with them. They turned us over to the DNR. Ultimately, Charlie Barrons came to our rescue. He's a well-known name within the Department of Natural Resources. And he helped us with all of the paperwork and the resources that we needed to get submitted into Firewise USA. And in late 2019, we were finally certified as a Firewise community. And since then, we became a 501c3 so that we can accept donations and help fund our programs. We've been working with the master HOA out here in the Tehaleh development, and we've slowly gained a good foothold with them to where they're starting to allow us to do more and more to benefit the entire community.
Thanks, John. It's really impressive to see the work that you and your small motley crew are doing up there. Just for people's information, John just hosted a wildfire cleanup day a couple weekends ago, and he got almost 100 folks to show up to work on a wildfire cleanup project. So John and John is a great example locally of how Firewise works when you want to look at your whole neighborhood and you want to work with your neighbors, not just on your property alone, because we know wildfire doesn't honor boundaries or property lines.
We had to entice the volunteers by feeding them hot dogs and hamburgers.
Jake, you're third up.
Hey, hi, everybody. Thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight. It's a very important topic. I'm Jake Whidbey. I work for Orting Valley Fire and Rescue. I've been there for just over 20 years. I'm our wildfire program manager, and we are very proud that we are implementing some of these tools into our community with our partners. I'm just here tonight to answer any questions and hopefully gather some more interest.
Great. Well, thank you, three. We're going to switch over to questions and answers now. I'm getting a ton, but just to kick things off, maybe I'll ask the group, feel free to take this on, any one of you. Why would a community want to become Firewise? What benefit is there to doing that?
I'm happy to jump in.
Sure.
I guess not to speak for my communities, but I see myself as part of their communities in essence by having be that local point of contact and bringing together the agency's support to help them support their communities. But what I've heard a lot from my community on Whidbey Island and those who've gone through the Firewise USA national framework with us is it's been fun. It's an opportunity to get to know their neighbors. And in our world, with how busy everyone's been, and especially the pandemic having, isolated much of us, it's an opportunity to get outside, breathe some fresh air, get to know one another, and also collaborate on something meaningful that brings about a spirit and a sense of community. So that's really been a big takeaway. Obviously, wildfire is an important topic to them, and that's what brought them together. From there, a lot of additional work around emergency preparedness and community building has transpired. So That's a big theme amongst communities that I've seen folks kind of realize.
And you get a lot of good work done too along the way.
Yeah.
John, I have a great question here that I think you're perfect for answering. The question is, how do you reach out to Firewise, or how's the best approach with your neighbors about how to manage a fire? I know you've been through that process itself.
I don't quite, what are you asking there? I didn't quite catch what
I guess, you know, the question is, how do you, maybe I would change it, like, who would you reach out to about Firewise? Who did you reach out to when you were just getting started?
I started out with our local fire department, East Pierce Fire and Rescue. And they came out and met with me. We walked through some of our trails. We went to the DNR, got them involved. And then I roped in a couple of neighbors and got them excited enough to where they would help me with the grunt work, and the process started. And probably one of the biggest benefits that I gained from this is the knowledge of, and trying to share this knowledge with residents. I have neighbors that will come up and say, well, I've got a 100-foot fir tree that's 30 feet from my house that's going to catch fire and then fall over on my house. And we go, no, they don't catch fire and then fall over. They fall over long after they're dead. But so we've really pushed the educational aspect, how to clean up around your yard, how to Firewise with drought resistant, fire resistant plants, using crushed rock instead of bark. And once your crushed rock's down, you don't have to replenish it every other year, so you're saving money there too. So the educational aspect is what we've pushed a lot, and I've gotten a lot of enjoyment, and I think so have the other guys that I'm working with, out of just trying to help make everybody a little more aware of how Western Washington fire reacts compared to what they see on the news in California and Arizona and whatnot.
Excellent. I had another question here. And Jake, maybe you can take this on. The question is asking about what resources are available for property owners to assess risk for their properties or for their community as a whole. And I know that you're doing that work actually right now up at Patterson Creek or Patterson Road.
Yeah, it's a great question. You know, once you've made contact and shown interest with your jurisdiction, whether it's a fire district, a city, the county, or the Washington Department of Natural Resources, we will come out and we have some tools that we will use and work with you to look at your property and help give you pointers on, you know, where you can make improvements, or even reassure you that your place looks good. And then once we do that, we can, those tools stay with you. You'll get an email and you can make a list. You know, these projects don't happen overnight. This can take many months to get your home where you want it to be, or, you know, so don't be afraid of this because it looks like it's a lot of work. It takes time, and little things over a long period of time will add up and it will pay off in the end.
Excellent, Jake. Yeah, I'm getting some, you know, some comments or questions here about, you know, what I can do, but also what I can't do. It sounds like there's some challenges here, especially around, you know, when you live on a smaller acre plot and you border a community property. You know, John and actually Nate, I think it'd be great if you could take team on this question related to undeveloped lots and how to maintain that undergrowth vegetation. I know that in the Tehaleh Trilogy community, you've got those larger wildlife corridors, and I know that's been a topic that keeps coming up over and over again. And Nate, I know you've been out and walked those properties, and I'm sure that you have some thoughts about game planning, I guess, around how to approach dealing with that.
Well, sure. Yeah. I mean, there's some specificity in terms of how we actually manage vegetation treatments on kind of a broader scale, outside the parcel level, outside the individual property. But of course, ultimately that comes down to, and when you say undeveloped lots, a lot of that has to do with, ownership, jurisdiction, and, you use John's community as an example. Ultimately what that requires is the type of cooperation and collaboration that John's been working on. And then, ultimately it's finding the capacity. Vegetation treatment is expensive. There's no way to sugarcoat that. It's very labor intensive, whether we use, mechanical means, masticators, feller bunchers, kind of forestry equipment, or whether we're using hand tools, chainsaws, and, individuals moving across landscape to treat vegetation to achieve some of those things that those slides that I was using, were representing, raising the canopy, lowering the ladder fuels, et cetera, et cetera. And again, just to reiterate, the two ways we do that are through mechanical mastication and mechanical equipment treatments, or by what we call hand treating. But again, that's, individuals with pole saws, chainsaws, cutting that brush, pulling it to a chipper, piling it and burning it. There's a whole variety of different treatment methods. All of them have their pros and cons. Of course, pile burning has smoke and air quality issues, clearance issues, restrictions with that. Chipping it is very logistically intensive in terms of, equipment and that kind of thing. So it does take quite a bit of planning. And that's, kind of where this Firewise collaboration really is beneficial, because that brings everybody into the room and can begin those conversations, because it does take some time to get the planning done. And then of course, implementation. And then finally, the component that gets missed a lot too is the maintenance. Once you have maintained, or, gotten the vegetation to the state that you want it to be in to mitigate wildfire risk. Of course, vegetation continues to grow, and there's that maintenance component too. So, one thing about Firewise, it doesn't come with any specific monetary incentives, but it's always another flag in your cap when you're applying for mitigation grants and all those types of things. So did that get at your question, Nick?
Yes, I think so. John, do you think you could add anything to Nate's answer there, especially around some of the wildlife quarters you're dealing with? And actually, having that conversation with the HOA board and trying to talk them through why wildfire mitigation makes sense, but also benefiting wildlife too.
Well, yes, and we are a very unique community, I think. The Tehaleh community is a master planned development of over 10,000 homes plus commercial. They left a huge buffer of wild native vegetation around between them and existing developments. And they, we encompass this whole upper plateau just up above the city of Orting. And in between, to separate these 10,000 homes, they've created wildlife corridors of native vegetation, 100 to 150 feet wide. And when we get windstorms, then we get trees down. And there was misunderstanding about whether the trees had to stay or whether they could come out, or once they fall, what you did with the debris. And so we've been working with the HOA hand in hand to figure out a way of helping to clean up some of the fuel debris, which in turn lowers the anxiety of the neighbors. We have neighbors out here that all think we're going to burn because there's just too much here. And, but we are making progress. We're educating the homeowners. We've got the HOA is now working hand in hand with us, and we've made some really good strides this summer. And we're looking forward to a long-term relationship with the HOA out here. And they own the land. And
they own most of it, right? Yeah. Yeah, it can be difficult to track all the conversations and all the different people that you need to interact with, because your neighborhood and your community have a lot of different players involved. And so it's always good to just start with the one step that you can take and then see where interest takes hold with your neighbors and just go along for the ride. And the good thing is you have really excellent support from your local fire districts, from DNR and from the conservation district to be able to talk you through what a plan looks like. Paul, I think I might have a good question for you, but somebody else could take this on. The question is, when a fire is coming from a certain direction, for example, from the northeast, are there factors that we should always be aware of that will inform our strategy for an escape plan?
Yeah, go the other way. No, but in all seriousness, that is a great question. And one of the things we have in our wildland protection plan up here is they're exactly right, depending on, again, we get down to the weather, fuels, and topography. Your fire management team, we have several evacuation routes available to us, and we would look at conditions and we would select the best evacuation route, and then would disperse that information to the community. I was just actually answering someone else's question about the evacuation of livestock. And again, that's a normal part of planning for any fire management team. During the North Peak fire, we evacuated the livestock in Greenwater, not including elk, down to the King County Fairground really early on, just because of the logistics of that. But there's no there's no cut and dried answer for which way you're going to go until you see what the fire conditions are. But any community and any Firewise community, any fire district should certainly be looking at that and making a plan. We're fortunate in our district, we have State Route 410 running right through the middle of the district, and you can go east or you can go west. And that's pretty much our only choices. We only have one road in and out, but it's located very nicely for an evacuation route. When we had the fish fire, we didn't have to evacuate, but people's only path of travel to get in and out of the fire district for a while there was to the east and down through Packwood. So it's always going to be subject to situations. So if the fire specified a direction from, what was it, north and east?
Yes.
Then, I mean, it's kind of a glib answer to say you'd go south and west, but it's kind of also a straightforward answer. You'd have to look at what the roads are and what the routes are. You'd have to look at if you're evacuating people, if you have someplace that's not only safe for them to go, or they're going to have resources available to them. And it's going to vary by community and by situation.
Thanks, Paul.
That was a lot of words. Didn't say much.
That was a lot of words. I will say too, the Pierce County Department of Emergency Management, and I'll send a link by email as well. They have a really great resource called Neighborhood Emergency Teams. And they also use something called Map My Neighborhood, so that you and your neighbors can come up with a plan when you only have 10 minutes to get out of your neighborhood. And if you have folks that don't have cell phones or aren't on your telephone tree, you know the 2 doors that you have to knock to make sure that they get out there safely. So I will be sure to also share a link when it comes to my sending out an email. Kelsi, I'm gonna kick back one of my own questions to you. What kind of resources are out there for folks to learn more about Firewise if they want to just start Googling? What are some really basic things that they can learn about and do on their own properties without even needing a ton of support from their fire department or DNR?
Yeah, I guess 2 answers. We've been tossing around this idea of Firewise and using it in different contexts, reminding you all that the Firewise USA program is a national framework. So it's a 4-step framework. It's organize, plan, do, and then share. So organizing meaning the formation of, a group of you in your community. Maybe it's just 3, maybe you have some established HOA, maybe you have a water board you share, maybe it's all informal, but bringing together those initial enthusiastic folks to then do a community-wide, whatever that size of your community is, to do an assessment of what your wildfire hazards are, and then to create an action plan that spans a couple of years, and then to actually do some work towards that. So I just wanted to remind everyone that when we say Firewise, or at least when I say Firewise, I'm meaning this framework that exists. And so with that, in terms of how one can learn more about wildfire preparedness and the Firewise framework, first is to visit the National Fire Protection Association's Firewise USA website. And that's resources that I believe Nick's going to follow up with everyone on. That page is great because it provides you with kind of 4 core things. It first of all tells you about those 4 steps in a little more detail and provides you with templates. What is a community-wide wildfire assessment, what things are looked at, who does it. It can be one of you in the community. It can also be your local fire district. Ideally, it's somebody from an agency with fire expertise. That website also has not only those templates, but it also has the opportunity for you to get trained on assessing structure ignition potential. So you can attend a training or have a training be brought to you from NFPA where you can learn to be an assessor of properties. If you yourself wanted to spearhead that initiative and didn't have the local resources from an agency group to do that. And then also there is funding available if one is pursuing the Firewise USA community model every year as part of the NFPA's Community Wildfire Preparedness Day, which is the first Saturday in May of every year. They will have, the last at least 6 years I've been doing this, they'll have a National Fire Protection Association and State Farm mini grant of up to $500. Perhaps, John, you've applied for those and utilized those. Great. Our communities too, multiple years in a row, they've gotten it. And it really helps, it helps pay for perhaps a chipper rental or food for a gathering, all sorts of great stuff. Again, all of this you can start by going to NFPA's Firewise USA website, where it will show you those different tools, trainings, and grant opportunities. Keep in mind, if you have large forested acreage and you're looking to perhaps address some of the fuel loading, there are additional funding opportunities for you that may be a good fit. It's worth a shot. The prominent one that comes to mind is our U.S. Department of Agriculture's Natural Resource Conservation Service Environmental Quality Incentive Program, or EQIP. I know it's a big, I try to actually speak acronyms. In my world, there are acronyms everywhere, but EQIP, Environmental Quality Incentives Program, exists through our Farm Bill, and it's for forest land and farmland, and fuel work can be part of that if it's a forest health issue. So something to think about is a cost share program. So those are some resources to get you going with Firewise. If you want to just learn more about like our wildfire ecology here in Western Washington, I will share some of my top kind of webinar or video resources that my communities have enjoyed. One is a Cisco Morris video that DNR partnered with Cisco from our local news on wildfire resistant landscaping tips. Another is a great webinar from our local Washington State University Extension Forestry program, where their DNR and their forestry people come together and talk about wildfire in Western Washington specifically, and that was only done 1.5 years ago, so it's pretty relevant and recent. And lastly, I don't know if any of you watch King 5, but Glenn Farley is a news reporter there and did a 1-hour-long presentation called Scorched Earth that you can find on the King 5 website, and it's great. It features some local Firewise communities. I believe down in your area, we were featured up here, and it talks about that local wildfire history and current recent fire events, and has a lot of great different speakers. So those are a couple of the key resources.
Thanks, Kelsi. Maybe afterwards you can email me a few of those links and I can be sure to pass it along to everybody here.
I have my list ready to give to you.
Good. You know, and I think a first place to point people to, and I did bring this up earlier, is that we do have an interest form that we've created, and it's going to ask you questions about your neighborhood. It's going to ask you about what you're interested in, if you're interested in becoming a Firewise community, if you're interested in an assessment. And so I just put it in the chat, but again, I'll send it out over email too. We will make sure that once you reach out to us, you're going to get put into contact with the right person. And again, there are more resources and there's more money that is coming later in the year. And so this wait list basically is going to be a place for us to start once we get that money, to start reaching out to you and providing more of those services. I think we're petering out here on some of these questions. We got some questions here, unfortunately, that we weren't able to get around to, but afterwards I'll be able to download all of these and try to find the best way to answer them, who can answer them, and then we'll post them on our website so that you can refer back to them. And as far as that goes, do any of the panelists have a couple of parting words of wisdom for attendees before we exit out of here?
Get involved.
Get involved.
I would say that remember that the wildfire is unique to your local ecology and your local arrangement of fuel, weather, and topography. So all of those unique plans that you create are gonna be unique to you. It's good to get that foundational knowledge under your belt, understanding how homes ignite and how fire its behaviors, you know, how Nate and Paul and all of the folks so far have shared this, but learning your local ecology is going to be really important, because then you'll know moving forward how to bring together that community culture and the ecology to hopefully, you know, make a long-term difference for everyone.
Since we're on a roll, Jake, Paul, Nate, do you want to add a couple of closing thoughts there?
Yeah, I'll jump right in there, Nick. One of the most important things is being prepared for the unknown, and preparing for wildfire to come to your community is important. You will make friends, you will improve your property, you'll improve your quality of life. And the added benefit to this is that you're also preparing for flooding, power outages, a volcanic eruption, an earthquake. Who knows what's coming down the pipe, you know? So it'll give you a peace of mind that you are ready. And I would encourage everyone to try and get involved in some manner. It will, from the fire side, from the fire department, and the way that we respond to your community and your emergencies, if you are preparing, you're helping us to help you. If we have a community who has participated in Firewise and has prepared their properties, when we arrive with our limited number of resources, we are more effective. And our goal is life safety, number one, and property conservation. So if you can get involved, you're going to help me. Selfishly, you're going to help me do my job.
Thanks.
And I would just add real quick, you know, we don't fight hurricanes, we don't fight earthquakes, we prepare for them. We shouldn't just uniquely just fight fire. There is both a proactive and a reactive component to fire preparation, and Firewise is part of that.
I will jump in and add, I was very grateful that our community was educated and prepared when the North Peak fire came down the pike, and there is really nothing that brings a community together more than overcoming some adversity like that, working together towards a common goal. Out here in the mountains, we get slapped around by Mother Nature on a fairly regular basis. And every time you face a problem together as a community and solve it, then you're just going to do that much better on the next problem.
Well, thank you, Five. I've soaked in a lot of information here, and I hope the same for everybody that's on the call. All of these folks here have an amazing background in this work, bring a lot of information to the table, and are still doing a lot of really great work in their communities. So applause for their presentations, but also for the good work that they continue to do. And once more, there will be an email coming out within the next day or two with a recording of the webinar, and then a link to that interest form, and then some other useful resources that came up today. We're only a phone call away, an email away, and we're here to help you. So thank you all. Have a good rest of your evening, and hope this isn't the last time that we see each other. Bye.
Thank you.